Hey, one more thing before you go. Today we're diving into the world of fantasy sports. It's an incredible phenomenon that's as American as baseball and apple pie, and has captivated millions of fans worldwide. Have you ever wondered how it all began? What events and individuals contributed to making fantasy sports the multi-billion-dollar industry it is today? Stay tuned. We're going to answer these questions and so many more with a great guest who can give us those origins. I'm your host, Michael Hurst. Welcome to One More Thing Before You Go. Our guest today is Larry Schechter. He not only is a fantasy sports enthusiast, but a legend in the field. Larry is the author of the 2014 Amazon bestseller, Winning Fantasy Baseball, and has been called one of the best fantasy baseball players in the world. He's a two-time winner of the CDM Sports National Salary Cap Contest and has triumphed in the most prestigious expert leagues, including the USA Today sponsors LABR League 3 times and the Tout Wars Experts League 6 times. Known for his meticulous attention to detail, Larry's poured his expertise into researching, conducting interviews, and writing the history of fantasy sports, as well as the book we're going to talk about today. Welcome to the show, Larry.
Hi, Michael. Glad to be here.
What an amazing opportunity for us to be able to inspire, educate, and motivate some people today. I think I had mentioned before we started, this is my first introduction to fantasy sports, so I'm excited for you being here.
Great. I will educate you.
You know, I kind of like start at the beginning in my show. I like to get a little background on my guest, a little more in depth than what we talked about. Where did you grow up?
Schenectady, New York. Learning to read and write was a little confusing because my name is Schechter from Schenectady.
I would
So,
imagine. Kindergarten and kindergarten must have been interesting.
yeah, yeah.
So, what did you want to be when you grew up? Did you always want to be an author? Were you involved in sports from an early age?
Um, there was a time I wanted to be an author, and I think like the end of high school, first couple of years of college, I had an idea for a book. I thought I was going to write like the great American novel. Um, I kind of wrote a draft, and now I know it sucked. It never had a chance in a million years of being published. It wasn't any good. So that was the end of it. So I had no idea that years later I would actually publish a couple of books that had to do with fantasy sports. Because fantasy sports didn't even exist when I was writing, the great American novel.
Um,
My first couple of years of college.
were you uh, were you involved in sports as a kid or through college or in that arena?
Yeah, I played little league baseball. I was not good at it, but I played golf. I'm pretty good at golf. So golf has been my main sport for years.
And got a right place down in Florida for golfing in beautiful weather, actually. So
Yeah,
that's what I love about Phoenix. Phoenix has got so many golf courses here and the opportunity to golf other than July and August. Then it's just a little hot. Um, don't like to golf during those time periods. Um, help us understand fantasy sports. How'd you get involved in fantasy sports?
I went to college in Boston and lived in Boston for several years after college. And one day, approximately 1992, I was driving around Boston and I heard an ad on the radio for something that was a fantasy baseball league. It was actually a company offering fantasy baseball leagues. So I called, and I was immediately interested in joining that league. And played that for a couple of years. They went out of business, and I looked in um, I guess I looked in either the USA Today or the Sporting News or both of them, and I found some other companies that offered fantasy sports, and I signed up with one of those. And the story that I just told you is really, really unusual. If you ask 1,000 people, how did you first start playing fantasy sports? I quite possibly would be the only one who said I heard an ad on the radio. Most people heard about it from friends, or they saw an ad in the USA Today, or they saw an ad in the Sporting News. but hearing it on a radio ad is completely unusual.
I yeah, my first introduction into fantasy sports was actually friends of mine and colleagues
Yeah,
that
yeah,
were involved in it. So I didn't get involved in it in myself, but I could hear them picking their teams and picking their players and that kind of a thing. So yeah, I think it's pretty interesting the way that it's evolved. How like what were the origins? How did it go from where it is now and evolved into like a global entertainment powerhouse? Because it's like a multi-billion-dollar business now.
exactly. And that's why I wrote the book, The History of Fantasy Sports, because I've for several years I look around at the industry, and you've got millions and millions of people playing everything from fantasy football and fantasy baseball to fantasy wakeboarding, cricket, fantasy Iditarod. I mean, it's everything. It's worldwide. You got news services, stat services, Sirius XM radio, 24/7 channel for fantasy sports. When you watch an NFL game or baseball game or whatever, now they talk about fantasy statistics. So I wondered, how did we go from ideas people had years ago for games to where we are now with this multi-billion-dollar industry? And nobody's ever written a book like this. So that's why I decided to write the book. And to answer your question, there were precursors to fantasy sports. Going back even to the 1800s, there were the first board games where, like, you would slide a penny with your finger into a spring activated bat that would hit the penny into various holes. For baseball, it might say out, home run, single, double, whatever. And then in the 1900s, there were board games like Cadico Ellis All Star Baseball and Frank Layton's Football. And then you got into games like App and Stratomatic, which were based on the performance of real Major League Baseball players or football players, but it was their actual performance from prior seasons. And what I refer to as modern fantasy sports, the difference is it's based on actual performance of athletes, but for the upcoming season. So, for example, you would draft a fantasy football team in, say, August before the season starts, and then you don't know what's going to happen. So, as the season unfolds, you get the statistics of your players.
And I find that fascinating actually because in regard to that, obviously it gives us each an opportunity to kind of feel like we're involved in the sport.
Mhm.
We get to be there, so to speak. Who were some of the key figures that contributed to the early development of fantasy sports? I mean, you talked a little bit about what you had just done, but who, if I may,
Yeah.
who come up and said, "Wow, we could do this on a larger scale. We can create football teams, baseball teams, hockey. Does it work with hockey and everything else like soccer?"
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you said, yeah, I mean, you've even got like wakeboarding and cricket and Iditarod. So yeah, hockey, basketball, martial arts,
Martial arts,
curling.
even.
There's fantasy curling. I mean, there's fantasy everything. There's a
Wow.
list in my book. There's a list in my book where I wrote down like every type of fantasy that I came across in my research, and there's more than 50 items there. And I'm sure there were some that I hadn't even heard about. Yeah. So to answer your question, fantasy, there's a guy named Bill Winkenbach who was a 10% owner of the Oakland Raiders, and in the late 50s, he had like a primitive fantasy baseball game and a primitive fantasy golf game. And in 62, I think it was 62, he was on a flight with some other people associated with the Raiders, and they were going to New York to play the Jets, who actually then they were called the Titans. They became the Jets. And on this trip, he mentioned his fantasy golf and fantasy baseball games to a couple of people, and they're like, "We should do that for football." And they stayed up all night talking about it, developing rules, and they're like, "Yeah, let's do this." But it was already the season had already started, so they had to wait till next fall of '63 to actually start their league. So they started their fantasy football league in '63, but they kept it amongst themselves. Um, Interesting though, one of the original players was the what's his name, Jerry Wolf, the who. I got to look this up while we're talking because the name is escaping me. But the guy who became the Hall of Fame general manager for the Green Bay Packers, um, and I can't think of his first name. It's something Wolf. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Um, anyway, so he was one of that was just an aside. He was one of the first members. Um, but they kept it amongst themselves. But there's a guy who was in the league, the original league, named Andy Musolimus, and he he's the guy who's responsible for really spreading the game. Um, he owned a bar in Oakland, and after a year or two in the league, he decided it would be a good idea for business to make the game available to his patrons, and he did, and people formed a league, and they loved it. The next year, they had a second league, and then a third league, and then a women only league because there were women that wanted to play, but the men didn't want women to play in their league with them. Um, and this is how fantasy football really spread, is because Mussolini started these games in his bar. People, would spread it word of mouth. It went from Oakland to San Francisco. Then people would come in the bar from all over the country, and they'd see what they'd be like, what are these people doing? They'd find out about it. Before too long, Mussolini's had people from bar owners from bars all over the country calling him, asking, "Hey, what's this fantasy football thing I'm hearing about?" So he was really responsible for this starting to spread it. And one thing about my book, when I when I started to research the book, I mean, first of all, I had no idea what I was getting into. I thought it was something I could knock out in a few months. It took 18 months of full-time work researching, interviewing dozens and dozens of people, and writing the thing. Um, And when I started, my idea was I'm going to write a book called The History of Fantasy Sports, find out who did what when, how did it all happen. When I started all the research and talking to people, I started hearing fascinating stories. And I realized early on that if I just write the history of fantasy sports, it'll get the job done. It'll also come off as a very boring research paper. But instead of that, I got all these fascinating stories I'm hearing about people. So I'm going to tell the who, what, when, but focus on the stories. So instead of being a boring research paper, it'll be interesting. And that's what happened. I've got all these stories that are fascinating. Some are inspirational. Some will bring a tear to your eye. There's a lot of humorous stuff. And so the reviews have been fantastic. People say it's easy to read. It's fascinating. There's a guy, the Midwest Book Review said fascinating from start to finish. And that's a guy who never played fantasy sports because the book isn't really so much about fantasy sports as the stories of these people and what they did, the entrepreneurs that created this industry. Um, so one thing about Mussolini's, I couldn't interview Mussolini's because he's no longer living. But I tracked down one of his grandkids and got a little bit of information from him that hadn't been published anywhere because I read, I Googled article after article after article about Winkenbach and Mussolini's and the whole thing. And after like 20 articles about Mussolini's, I'm reading the same stuff that I've read 20 times, but once in a while there's some little tidbit that wasn't mentioned before. So I get like the 20th article from Mussolini's, and there's this thing mentioned. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this wasn't mentioned before. The guy was a war hero. Mussolini's, when he was 17 years old, Pearl Harbor happened, and he enlisted in the army, and his recruiter told him 97% of you are not going to return because they were putting them on a mission to go behind enemy lines. And they said 97% of you are not going to return alive, but he volunteered anyway. And obviously he survived. They gave him a cyanide pill, so if he got caught, he could kill himself. So, it's like spreading, playing fantasy football, spreading fantasy football was, the least, of the important things that he did in his life compared to that. He
Mm,
later got
yeah.
his mission was top secret for years. And then after years and years, they finally made it public and he went to Washington and got an award.
That's amazing, actually. I think that the mere fact that 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 was a minor aspect of his life, at least the way it was showcased, and it was him that
Yep.
kind of helped it transform into the niche hobby into a kind of a mainstream sensation, which I think, again, we hear about it everywhere. It's all over. You heard it on the radio. We watch it. We hear about it on TV and in the news. Which brings me to, we mentioned this as you were talking, that it all started off pretty much word of mouth. It all started off in an arena that our friends were talking about, our colleagues were talking about it. How has technology impacted the growth of fantasy sports over the years? So how is that? I'm sure it had to have a major impact in regard to not only spreading the word, but the actual participation in it. It made it easier, I'm sure.
Yeah. Before I before I get to that, let me just tell you about one other person from your first question. But by the way, I got to say something about Mussolimus. And one more thing about Mussolimus that I little tidbit that I read and finally read in an article that I thought was very cool. Says a lot about the guy. His bar. This is back in the '60s in Oakland. His bar, and it was mentioned he was one of the very first bartenders in the Oakland area that welcomed black people. That's very cool because back then, even in Oakland, you had racism. So yeah. Anyway, the other guy I got to mention because anyone who's listening to this is somewhat familiar with fantasy sports or fantasy baseball has probably heard of Dan Okrent. Dan Okrent is the guy credited with inventing fantasy baseball, which was originally called rotisserie baseball. Um, Now, he did start a league in 1980, and he is the person primarily responsible for creating fantasy baseball. However, there's a lot of myths out there that are not true. One of them is that the idea magically came to him on a plane ride from Connecticut to Texas. In fact, that was even part of a 30 for 30 ESPN special. That's not true. It goes back years before that. There's a whole long story of what happened. Um, there are also a lot of people who were playing kind of like their own primitive games of fantasy baseball years before that, but they were primitive games and they didn't spread. It was just friends playing with friends. So what Okrent came up with is his version of fantasy baseball that he invented is kind of like chess compared to everybody else who might have been playing checkers. And the other thing about Okrent is he was a writer, and the people he got in his first league were writers, editors, magazine publishers, kind of like that. So they got publicity. There were some articles written, like in the New York Times, for example. They got on the Today Show. In 1984, they got a book deal with Bantam Books to write a book about it. So that's how it all spread. It's because he invented a very sophisticated game, and they were getting publicity, so it spread. In fact, the 1984 book, Bantam Books, they sold, I think, about 50,000 copies. Lots and lots of people read that book and started their own leagues. And in fact, some of like Matthew Berry, for example, who right now is probably the most famous fantasy sports, analyst or whatever you call him, he's read that book when he was 14 years old and joined a league. That's how he got started in fantasy sports.
That's really interesting, actually. I think that allowing that, and I'm sure, again, technology has got to be play a part in it these days where it allows us to be able to create a fantasy team so much easier and be able to share
Yeah,
that and spread it and kind of bounce it
right. So
around.
yeah, so now getting to that your question on technology. Yeah, so the first back before technology and the internet, when people started playing, I started playing about 1992. But, lots of people were playing in the '80s, and back then you didn't have information. You could just go on the internet. So people who were really taking it seriously, they would like they'd go to there are people they would go to the newsstand on Sunday and buy every out of town newspaper they could find, take the sports section, throw out the rest, and they'd read the sports sections, trying to get little tidbits of information about that paper's local football team or baseball team.
Mm.
And if they did that, they had a big advantage over their competitors. Um, and they also people would call the PR offices of teams. Like they'd call the Phillies front office and pretend they were a reporter or something and say, hey, Mike Schmidt's got a groin injury. How long is he going to be out for? And then yeah, at first the PR offices would think these people were bookies. And then later on they realized, well, most of them weren't bookies. They were fantasy baseball players, and it was a real pain in the ass for them. There's a guy named Bob Harris started a company kind of because of this. Bob Harris got an idea for like an advice newsletter for fantasy football, and he called the PR offices of the teams. And he said, listen, I know these idiots are calling you asking you stupid questions. Here's what I have an offer for you. Give me the information, and then everybody else who calls, tell them to call me. So they happily agreed to that, and he started a business where he had all this information, and he started charging people to call him. So my book is full of stories of entrepreneurs who saw something that was needed and didn't exist, and they started it, or maybe it existed, but they thought they could do better. Because
Mm-hmm.
back at the beginning, like people said, well, boy, this fantasy football thing is great, but there's no information. So let's start a magazine, or let's write a book, or let's start a news service or whatever. Um, the first kind of technological breakthrough, to get to your question, was computers. So when computers came around, there was some people realized, like, wait a minute, we could use this for fantasy sports, because the commissioners of leagues or somebody in the league would have to do all the moves and statistics and standings by hand. They'd have to get the box score from the paper and do everything by hand. When computers came out, people realized, like, whoa, we can use computers for this. So instead of a commissioner taking 10 hours a week, do it all by hand, we can do it with computers. So some people became entrepreneurs and started statistic services. One of them was a couple from Pennsylvania, Jim and Gloria Berger. And what they started a service for baseball and football. And what they had to do back then for baseball is the Tuesday edition of the USA Today would have the American League statistics, and Wednesday would have the National League statistics. So Gloria would read the statistics from the USA Today. Jim would put them in the computer. The computer would calculate all the results, and they'd mail reports to their clients on Wednesday night. So that's kind of like I talk about like the who, what, when of the history of fantasy sports. But then the subtitle of the book is, and the stories of the people who made it happen. This is where the flavor comes in. So one Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with her first child, and they did not let a little thing like going into labor stop them from doing their job. So in between contractions, Gloria would read Jim the statistics, and then she'd be like, "Oh wait, hold on, here comes another one. Ah, okay, it passed." And the contraction would pass, and she'd continue. And they got their statistics done, the reports out in the mail that Wednesday night on time. And the the daughter that was born that day, now 37 years later, plays in the fantasy football league with her dad.
Now that's dedication.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely
And then
dedication.
and then the other big, then the huge technological breakthrough was the internet. With the internet, it made it really easy for people to play, to find leagues to join. They could make their own moves online instead of having to go through the commissioner or stat service. You could get your reports online instead of having to wait. You used to have to wait to get them in the mail. Like if you were in a, a league, a football or baseball league, the stat week probably ended on Sunday, and you wouldn't get your report. You'd have to wait to get it in the mail on Wednesday or Thursday. When fax machines came out, that made it easier. Some people would fax the reports. Um, one of the people I interviewed was the owner of a company that offered games, and he remembers the first time somebody called him and said, "Hey, instead of the mail, could you start sending my report by
Big
fax?"
facts.
And his answer was, "What's a fax?"
Oh, that's funny. It's interesting the evolution where how somebody finds the right place, right time, right technology, and take advantage of that for, like you said earlier, from an entrepreneurial perspective, and then make life so much easier for all of us.
Yeah.
in especially within this industry. Do you think the role of like media or broadcasting helped to popularize it?
Oh yeah, definitely. So what happened is when fantasy sports started, the media was kind of split. Like take base, half the media thought this is terrible. This is going to ruin the game because people are only rooting for their players and statistics. They're not rooting for their teams. And the other half of the media thought this is great. It's like, Dan Okrent started his league in 1980, and I mentioned got lots of publicity. A lot of people started playing, and he says he thinks by like 81 or 82, there was a fantasy baseball league in every major league press box. Someone in
Wow.
the press would start their own league with other people in the press. So like you got half the people playing fantasy baseball, and you got half the people thinking this is terrible. It's going to ruin the game. And and I think it was 81. Everything in the book is factually correct. I don't remember every little detail, so I might say something that's not quite correct, but in the book it's correct. I think it was 81 was when there was a Major League Baseball strike, and so um, during the strike, the baseball writers didn't have anything to write about. Usually they just write about the games. So some of them started writing about their own fantasy teams, which again helped publicize it.
That's interesting. Now, is there this can be a strange question, but is there a conflict for the actual players to be playing in a fantasy team or having a fantasy team? Sort of like Pete Rose. Pete Rose got in trouble for betting on baseball so much.
Yeah.
Is there an issue with that with the teams and the players?
No, no, there's no issue. It's unusual for someone to have themselves on a fantasy team, but if they did, they'd be trying hard. Yeah, I mean, like the thing with Rose is, Rose, if you're a Major League Baseball player betting on a game, you could throw a game and lose intentionally, or
Right.
you could bet on your team, but you're using inside information that people don't know about. But fantasy is different. Like um, Maurice Jones-Drew, very good, well-known football player. He got into fantasy pretty early on, and he would always draft himself. He'd always pick himself first on his team.
That way, make sure he's always picked first. I can respect that. I can respect that. How's the business of fantasy sports changed, like the sporting industry as a whole? Do you think? Do you think it's had an impact on it?
Well, there's a whole fantasy industry. Obviously, it's like a $25 billion a year industry that's
Yeah.
sprung up. And all kinds of related businesses. You got statistics services, news services, advice services, um, companies that offer games for people to play, and now there's analysts on when you watch when you turn on an NFL game or Major League Baseball, they talk about fantasy or they have their own fantasy shows. Um, like mainstream sports coverage now kind of includes a lot of references to fantasy or fantasy specific
From
shows
that
even.
perspective. So, the founders probably never would have thought in their lifetime that it would turn into a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Right, of course. And think that they're when I started researching the book, I did not know the vast majority of what's in the book. And a lot of people who've played fantasy sports for years or even been in the industry for years didn't know most of what's in the book. Um, One thing that blew my mind, and most people that hear this, when I started researching the book, I had seen the statistic that estimates approximately 50 million people in the U.S. play fantasy sports, and that's just adults, age 18 and over. It doesn't even include under 18, and there are lots of under 18 playing fantasy sports. So we got 50 million people in the U.S. playing fantasy sports. I knew that. What I didn't know is in India, guess how many people are playing fantasy cricket in India?
I would say because
Two,
of the population of India, it's got to be amazing number,
two,
millions.
yeah, 200 million.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah. And the big cricket company out there in India is worth $8 billion.
$8 billion.
Yeah,
That's phenomenal. That's crazy.
right.
Yeah, it is. I think from a perspective of trying to understand the comparison between the fantasy sports and in a normal sports arena, the amount of money that's going through for both those industries is just an immense amount of money that we've invested as a society and a culture in sports alone.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's pretty crazy. What kind of challenges do you think or controversies have has fantasy sports faced throughout history? I mean, do you cover that in your book?
Yeah, yeah. The book covers really everything. It starts with the precursors of fantasy sports, the invention and spread of fantasy football, the invention and spread of fantasy baseball, the first commercial games, the first magazines and books, news services, stat services, just everything
Right.
through more modern times like daily fantasy sports and worldwide expansion. Um, and there's been a whole lot of legal issues. Kind of get to your question. I mean, ever since the beginning, there was a question of is fantasy sports gambling? Because most leagues have some money involved. Not necessarily a lot of money, but something. So ever since the beginning, there's been a question: is it legal or is it gambling? Even going back to Andy Mussolini and his bar, their scoring system. Um, they if you got a touchdown or whatever, they called them like 10-cent leagues and 20-cent leagues where like you got 10 people in the league. So if I get a touchdown, if my guy gets a touchdown, if I'm in a 10-cent league, that means I get 10 cents from the other players. So the nine other teams, I get 90 cents. So that's kind of how they worked it. So there was money involved. Um, and what they did is instead of calling it cents, they called it points because they didn't know if one day the vice squad might come into the place and arrest everybody. So this was a question for years, and there were a couple of incidents in the '80s where a fireman got arrested in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. They had a fantasy league. He was arrested for gambling, and then there was some people playing a league in a bar in Austin, Texas, got arrested for gambling, and um, the question kind of lasted for years: is it gambling or not? Finally, got resolved by the federal government, determined it's not gambling. And most states at this point have determined it's not gambling, but there are a few states where they say it is gambling, and it's not legal to play if money's involved.
Yeah, it's kind of like back to the thing I asked earlier about Pete Rose being involved in getting busted for what he was doing, and so that clarifies that. I appreciate that. It gives me a better understanding from that too. How do you
Yeah,
see the?
yeah.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I was going to say one of the people I interviewed, Clay Walker, was the head of the NFL Players Association for many years,
Hmm.
and when they were considering a bill about fantasy sports being legal or not, he testified to Congress. And some of the congressmen were concerned. Well, if fantasy sports is legal, or um, could players be bribed? Like they could be bribed to throw a game. Could they be
Right.
bribed to throw a football game? And Clay Walker explained to them, um, you can't bribe a player to do better.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like Emmett Smith, you can't bribe him to play better.
Yeah. That's a nice way to put that. I think it's a nice analogy to put that. How do you see the future of fantasy sports evolving? Do you see it evolving any more than it already has?
I can't really envision how, but I would say, I mean, probably just it's come so far. um, 10 years ago or whatever, I don't think, people would have envisioned daily fantasy sports. 10 years ago or so, daily fantasy sports didn't exist yet.
Right.
And, you know, people wouldn't have envisioned that something, daily fantasy sports would come along. And now you got, DraftKings and FanDuel and just, you can't watch a sports event without knowing about DraftKings and FanDuel.
And that kind of a deal. What about virtual reality or artificial intelligence? I just had a conversation, I guess, about a week ago, where they were talking about the involvement of VR and AI in so many aspects of our life and society. Do you think, just from your experience and what you've researched, do you think that it might eventually evolve into like the virtual reality, the Oculus, the Meta, where people can participate from that direction?
Well, I don't really know hardly anything about this, but um, fantasy sports is based on the activities of others. So I'm
Mm.
not sure how that
How
could
that would
apply.
work? It
Yeah,
may not fit within our arena. I mean, I just felt it was a question I thought needed to be asked only because, again, artificial intelligence has been, implementing itself in so many ways in daily life that,
right.
um, we've become the Star Trek generation now,
Yeah,
where
I suppose you might somebody could probably program artificial intelligence to try to help them pick like the ideal football
I know
team
football
or
game.
or the ideal predictions of what do you think Shohei Ohtani is going to do in 2025. I mean, like you can do that. And people do that themselves. Try to analyze statistics and things like this and figure out, okay, so this year coming up, Shohei Ohtani going to hit 40 home runs or 30 or 50 or whatever. So,
Yeah.
I'm sure you could program artificial intelligence to do that. Um,
Yeah, that takes the fun out of it. I mean, really, if you're in it. I'm an analytical person anyway. Yeah, as an investigator, an individual that spent a lifetime investigating things and piecing together crime scenes and
yeah,
tracking bad guys, everything else. I love the aspect of that, analyzing evidence and looking at things from a different way. To me, it would take the excitement out of it and saying, "Hey, I was right," or "I was, crap, I was
yeah,
wrong. Let's see what else I can do to fix that." Yeah, almost
yeah,
kind of almost cheating, just just maybe on the
yeah. And
verge.
but I don't know if I don't. I mean, I don't know if it would do better than you know a good a good analyst. I
An
don't know.
analyst does, yeah. What advice
But
would you?
I agree with you though. Kind of. I mean, if everybody, I mean, if there was like artificial intelligence doing this and it was better than what people can do and it was available to everybody, I mean, that would kind of ruin the
I think it
games.
would run
Like
the
if you
games.
competing with 12 people and everybody's using the same artificial intelligence, then you all have the same exact ideas
Same
of
answers.
what players to take. I think that would kind of ruin the game. That's like it reminds me of playing. Did you ever play the game Stratego?
I actually have it. Hmm.
Okay, it's a board game, and you kind of like there are two people playing, trying to like attack each other and defend against attacks.
Hmm.
And years ago, like a long, just years and years ago, I played this with my brother, and we played a bunch of games, and it was fun. And I won some, and he won some. But then my brother figured out the way to win the game is don't attack. Just hold back, let the other guy come after you. And he started doing this, and I didn't understand what he was doing. But after
Hmm.
we played a few games and he beat me those games, I realized what he was doing and why he was doing it, and it made sense. So now I realize, okay, the way to play this game is don't attack, hold back. So now you've got two people who are not attacking, they're holding back, and there's no point in playing the game anymore. I mean, we
Okay.
just sit there for hours and not do anything. So it's like, okay, we can't play this game anymore because it just got ruined.
Yeah, so like Battleship, kind of like Battleship. That old
Yeah,
game with Battleship where you had to guess how to sink somebody's battleship and which ones they are. Yeah, yeah.
right.
So it's interesting. What advice could you give to somebody looking to get started in fantasy sports? And I ask this for a little selfish reason because I told you I really haven't got into it, but I know a lot of people that are. But what advice could you give to someone like me looking to get started with it?
Well, first of all, pick a sport that you like. I mean, if there's no reason to play a fantasy sport if you don't already like that sport. So start with that. Um, as far as if you just Google, there's lots of opportunities to play. Like if you say, no, I want to play fantasy basketball. You could Google, what's out there for fantasy basketball, and find some kind of league that you think is interesting, or ask friends. Another good way is ask friends, hey, do you know anybody in a fantasy basketball league that I could join? Um, most people know people that are playing some kind of fantasy, especially fantasy football. And fantasy football is by far the most popular in the United States.
That would be good. I have plenty of people that are playing it, so I have plenty of resources in order to do that. And obviously, Google. I live on the computer lately, so Google seems to be a really simple way of at least giving myself another introduction into how to get into it. Right off, you just jump into it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
now we're in January. Baseball's the one that people could jump into. But one thing like daily, because I mean, football just ended, and basketball and hockey are already in progress. Um, but and daily fantasy sports has made it possible for people to start playing even when the season's
from
already
that
started.
perspective,
Yeah,
yeah. See,
but
I
but
like
it's quite a different thing though than the season long fantasy where you get into a league and it lasts the entire season. It's quite a different thing than the daily games.
from that perspective. I watch a lot of soccer. I do watch a lot of soccer. I have
Yeah.
my wife and I watch a little bit of football, mostly just the Broncos or the Cardinals. If they're playing or if they're in the playoffs, we'll watch the playoffs and things like that. So, but yeah, I might try that with soccer when the major seasons open up. I'll see if I'll jump into it and play a little bit. Well, let's talk about how to get your book.
The book is available on most booksellers' websites, paperback and ebook. It's Amazon is the one that has lots and lots of reviews and details about what's in the book.
And that's the history of fantasy sports. Again, I'll make sure that there's a link in the show notes so that the people have an easy way of going at least to Amazon. But you can find it everywhere. And does it come in a Kindle version as well?
Yeah,
Just a paperback or a hardback?
no, it's paperback and Kindle.
Paperback and Kindle.
Yeah,
So
and then if some, and most booksellers have it in ebook. So if somebody doesn't like Kindle, they like another ebook. It's probably available.
from that perspective, well, I'll
Yeah.
make sure that those are in the show notes and everybody can come in there. An amazing opportunity for me to learn about fantasy sports. I appreciate you coming on the show, Larry.
All right. Thanks for having me.
This is one more thing before you go. So,
Yeah.
do you have any words of wisdom for anybody that's wanting to jump into or is in fantasy sports at the moment?
Well, I think if you like fantasy sports, you'll love the book. It also makes a great gift for anybody who plays fantasy sports. It's something like when people play fantasy sports, a lot of us, we look for advice services that we think are helpful. And if we find something we think is really helpful, we do not want to share it with our league mates. We want to keep it for ourselves. Whereas this is a book you can buy this as a present for all your league mates because it's not anything about strategy or how to win. It's just something that they will like.
That's really good advice. Good advice. Yeah, I had informants, but I didn't share my informants. So I understand that statement.
Right. Wow,
Yeah.
it's a little heavier than fantasy sports.
Yeah, but it worked.
It's-
It worked. It worked.
oh, sure, of course. I mean, thanks for being a police officer. It's a
You're welcome.
you know great thing. And I mean, geez, now you know you got wildfires in California. I mean, God bless the firefighters. My God.
Yeah, I am. Our hearts go out. We have family and friends that are affected out in California with regard to that. It's a very difficult situation for everyone involved, and yeah, hearts and prayers.
Yeah.
go out to everyone that's affected by it, and to the first responders who are out there working the fires like they are, the police officers, firefighters, police officers, EMTs, volunteers. It's amazing. So hopefully they can get that under control pretty well, and pretty soon at least. Anyway, Larry, thank you very much. I'll make sure that the links are in the show notes, and I appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, and look forward to another conversation.
All right. Thanks a lot.
For everyone else out there, please like, follow, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for being a part of One More Thing Before We Go community. And one more thing before you all go, have a great day, have a great week, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of One More Thing Before You Go. Check out our website at beforeyougopodcast.com. You can find us as well as subscribe to the program and rate us on your favorite podcast listening platform.